Thank you so much for attending our first webinar in our Assessment to Action series. We are super excited to have you all here today. This first webinar is going to be focusing on how you can monitor state test readiness with summative assessments. So how can you build summative assessments and look at data from those summative assessments in order to see if your students are in fact ready and prepared to take their state science test. So first of all, Julie and I will go ahead and introduce ourselves. My name is Emily Miller. My pronouns are she, her. I was a high school chemistry teacher for 10 years. I taught in our alternative learning program. I taught regular chem. I taught honors chem. So I had a lot of opportunities to teach at a lot of different levels and try a lot of different strategies. While I was a teacher, I was an NGSS pioneer and advocate within my science department. And I was also a PLC lead. So I had the opportunity to lead a lot of data-driven dialogue, which was my favorite. And now I have the lovely opportunity to partner with districts to help them implement InnerOrbit within their schools. And my current show obsessions right now are Survivor and RuPaul's Drag Race. So that is what I'm spending my free time watching. Julia, could you please introduce yourself?
Of course. I've never seen Survivor, but I've heard amazing things about it. I will have to watch it. But my name is Julia Mota. I was a teacher and tutor for elementary students in the Dominican Republic for some years. But for the last 4 years, actually, I've been supporting teachers in districts with their NGSS implementation for this last 4 years. And now I partner and provide guidance to schools and districts implementing assessment in their NGSS instruction. I worked as a district engagement manager with InnerOrbit for the Eastern time zone states. And I'm also obsessed with severance. You're going to see a lot of gifts in this webinar about severance because I chose them all. So it's just the best show I've ever watched. Drop a heart if you like it too in the chat. Today, as Emily mentioned before, we're going to be talking about monitoring state test readiness with summative assessments. Our objective is to explore how to design summative assessments that can be administered throughout the school year that will produce state test aligned data. We will also highlight how InnerOrbit partner districts have been able to implement these strategies to help predict state test scores. And we're going to be here for about 45 minutes. We're going to start talking about what is InnerOrbit. It's just going to take 2 minutes or less. Then we're going to talk about the state data and alignment and the research that we went through. We're going to talk about some specific case studies, one in California, the other one in Oklahoma, and then also in Connecticut. Then Emily's going to walk us through some summative assessment structure strategies and some instructional summative strategies. And finally, we're going to go over some implementation recommendations. And please try to enjoy each fact equally as we go over them because our work is mysterious and important, right? So if you got that, if not, you should watch Severance. But I'm going to pass it over to Emily so she can talk about a little bit about what is InnerOrbit.
Thank you, Julia. If you did not understand the GIF reference, neither did I. So we're in the same boat. Though I have been heavily encouraged, maybe by somebody in this webinar, to watch Severance. So maybe I'll understand it here soon. So what is InnerOrbit? InnerOrbit is essentially 4 main things, the first of which is phenomena. So we give students opportunities to make sense of new novel situations with our questions. And so all of our question items are tied to some interesting real life situations within our phenomena. Speaking of the questions, we are an assessment platform. We have over 10,000 different assessment items that are all linked to the NGSS. And we've taken the time to make sure that these assessment items slowly scaffold in order to eventually build to 3-dimensional rigorous questions. So we've got prior knowledge questions, 1D, 2D, and 3D questions to hopefully get our students eventually able to do sense making. And we'll talk a little bit more about that question structure later in the webinar as well. We are also data, which I love, due to the fact that we tag our items as being 1-dimensional, 2-dimensional, or 3-dimensional with those different dimensions of the NGSS. We are then able to gather this really detailed data to see how students are doing on specific dimensions. So we can see how students are doing specifically on SEPs versus CCCs versus the DCI. And with this really detailed data, you can then actually implement some actionable change. So you can actually go and say, all right, if we're struggling on this SEP, I'm going to do this activity in order to help move that needle. And that's something that this webinar series is going to talk about as well. And the last thing that InnerOrbit is professional learning. So much like the webinar that we're doing right now, we love to be able to give professional development and learning opportunities to our partners and potential future partners in order to help everybody do the best that they can with the NGSS and the NGSS implementation. And with that, Julia is now going to talk to us a little bit more about the research that InnerOrbit just conducted about state test alignment.
Thank you, Emily. And without further ado, we're reaching the real meat of the webinar now. So at InnerOrbit, just so you know, and as I know we have some partners here, but our mission has always been to support districts and educators in implementing NGSS aligned instruction and assessment that truly fits their context. So one common thing we hear from our partner districts across the country is the need to prepare students for the state science test, while also staying true to the three-dimensional science learning. So we asked ourselves a key research question. Do InnerOrbit summative assessment scores align with NGSS state test proficiency levels? And this research project was designed to dig into that exact same question by analyzing student performance across states, grade levels, and assessment types. So let's take a look at what we found. And the results for this study were really exciting and affirming too. We found that schools can confidently, and districts too, can confidently use InnerOrbit's assessments as a reliable way to measure progress towards NGSS proficiency, especially when preparing for state tests. And what this means is that the three-dimensional data that teachers are gathering on InnerOrbit doesn't just support instruction, it also aligns with external measures of students' performance. So in other words, using InnerOrbit, educators can track mastery of NGSS standards while also building readiness for these state assessments. Now, to make sure our findings were really meaningful and reliable, we applied some pretty specific criteria when selecting our case study. So first of all, the data was collected in the past school year, so 2023, 2024. We only included districts that use a common InnerOrbit assessment across at least a third of the students in a tested grade level. And this helped us ensure that the data truly reflected district-wide implementation. We also focused on auto-scored questions, so two-dimensional and three-dimensional items that didn't really require a lot of teacher scoring to prevent and eliminate some bias or inconsistency in how some of these answers were evaluated. And because we wanted this to align directly with NGSS state test performance, we zeroed in on grades 5, 8, and 11, which are commonly tested across different states. And lastly, we only included states that have had an NGSS aligned science assessment in place for at least 3 years. So we're comparing against tests that have been stable and well established for some time. Now, here's where it all comes together. This chart shows the alignment between InnerOrbit summative assessments and state test proficiency levels, broken down by performance level and student group. And what's especially compelling is that the average alignment across all grade levels and groups is on average 97%, with no group falling below 90%. And this consistency tells us that regardless of state, grade, or student group, InnerOrbit can accurately reflect student performance as it's measured on high-stakes state tests. And it is a strong indicator of both reliability and validity of this data. Now, zooming in a little bit further, what's striking too about the data is that across all proficiency levels, student groups, and states, the score stayed within a 10% range, which is really, really tight when you think about the variety of districts and student populations involved. So it tells us again that InnerOrbit is not only aligned with these state assessments, but these assessments that this district created were predictably aligned regardless of the grade level or the geographic region. And this kind of consistency is exactly what we need when we're trying to support all students and make data-driven decisions that connect to those high-stake testing experiences. And now that we've seen the overall findings, we want to take you a little bit deeper. So in the next few slides, I'm going to walk you through three different case studies, each from a different state, to show you how this alignment played out in real districts with real students using InnerOrbit in very different contexts. Now, before we dive into that, I want to quickly walk you through how we translated state test scores into InnerOrbit scoring so we could compare apples to apples. So for each state, we started by identifying the range of possible scale scores on their tests, basically the highest and lowest possible scores a student could earn. Then we found the minimum score needed for each proficiency level. Level 1s levels 1 through 4. And from there, we calculated what percentage of that total score range a student would need to earn in order to meet each level. So that gave us what we're calling the InnerOrbit cut score here, which is a simple percentage that allowed us to compare student performance directly between the state test and the InnerOrbit assessment. So for example, if a student needed 278 or out of 399, as we see in this case, to hit level 2, that translated into needing at least 39% correct on the InnerOrbit side to be considered a level 2. Now, for this project, we analyzed 3 different districts, as I said before, each in different states, to conduct a deep dive on how these assessments align with the NGSS state test performance. And these districts represent a range of implementation styles in different state test designs, giving us a well-rounded view on implementation. We're going to do Connecticut, then move to California, and then wrap up with Oklahoma. So our first case study comes from a small suburban district in Connecticut that just started partnering with us in 2023. They used the mid-year summative assessment to focus on 3 middle school physical science standards from the first semester. And each standard had 3 to 4 questions that were 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional, giving us a well-rounded sample of student understanding too. Now, looking at the data, what we're seeing here is a diverging bar chart that shows the percentage point change between how many students fell into each proficiency level on the InnerOrbit assessment versus the state test. And the biggest difference here was a 7% decrease at level 2, which actually coincided with a 6% increase at level 1. And on the flip side, we see a small bump on the top levels, about 1% and then 2% at level 4. Our second case study takes us in a large suburban district in California, which is another new partner from the school year 23-24. And this one, which makes it specifically valuable, is that we were able to look at 2 different tested grade levels, so 5th grade and 8th grade, and they were using different assessment formats. So starting with the 5th grade on the left side of the chart, the most noticeable shift on the data is a 10% decrease at level 4, which seems to have been redistributed mostly to level 1 and level 3. The takeaway here is that while a few students may have performed slightly better on the InnerOrbit assessment than on the state test, the middle bands stayed fairly stable, and the assessment still clearly identified those needing additional support. Now onto the 8th grade assessment, there's a much smaller percentage shift within a 3% range here. And the largest movement is at level 1, with a 3.2% increase and only minimal dips at levels 2, 3, and 4. So what this suggests is that the 8th grade assessment, with a few more questions and a free response item, this was the only one that had a free response item out of everything, may have captured student proficiency even more closely aligned to the state test, especially across those levels 2 through 4. And across both grades, the InnerOrbit data helped the district pinpoint students in need of support while still reflecting broader performance trends pretty accurately too. And now to our last case study. This one's coming from a large suburban district in Oklahoma, and this is one of our longer standing partners since 2022. And this district used a 30-question practice test built on InnerOrbit as a part of their district-wide prep for the state science assessment. They administer this type of assessment twice a year, but for this study, we focused only on the second semester results and the ones closest to state testing. Now, looking at the chart, what really stands out is just how tight the alignment is. And the largest shift is just 4%, with a small dip at level 3. There's a 2% increase at level 1 and a 1% increase at level 4, while level 2 stayed nearly flat. And this kind of alignment shows how intentional design and widespread implementation across a district can really pay off. Because when these assessments are well constructed and consistent across different classrooms, these scores can serve as a highly reliable indicator of how students will perform in the state test. And this is a great model of how a district can use a practice test to build student familiarity and gather meaningful and predictive data. And I know that's been a lot, but overall, our case study findings, as we looked at 3 different case studies, there were a few big takeaways that we could see. So first, longer summatives aren't always better. The most aligned results came from a summative assessment, but it wasn't necessarily correlated. The fact is that they came from focused assessments built only on priority standards. These districts have been partnering with InnerOrbit for multiple years, and the one that partnered since 2022 showed even stronger alignment because students are mostly exposed to these questions in different points of instruction. And this points the power of consistent implementation and practicing transferring. And it wasn't just the summatives that mattered. Formative and diagnostic assessments played a big role in building up student skills throughout the school year. And lastly, the dimensions report on InnerOrbit, which breaks performance down by SEP, DCI, and cross-cutting concepts Emily showed us before. It offers even more actionable insights for teachers. But if there's one big message, is the fact that practice makes progress here. So when students get enough chances to apply their knowledge in a new three-dimensional way, we start to see real growth on these state tests. And speaking of practice, let's just say if we keep giving students the right kind of assessments, their skills might try to rival Mr. Milkshakes as he was dancing there, but maybe they will get skills on SEPs instead of dancing. So I'm gonna now pass it over to Emily to walk us through some summative assessment structures that might be helpful for us to look at.
Thank you so much, Julia. I do want to quick acknowledge that we did get a question within our Q&A. I'm curious about the demographics of the districts that were featured within the case study. At this time, we don't have that specific of a breakdown as far as socioeconomic level, race, and ethnicity. We're currently in conversations with these districts to see if we are able to actually share the physical districts and the names of them, which then that information would be available. But up until right now, we're just able to share just that general term of if they were suburban versus urban, small or big. But if we are able to share more information later, and if we're given that permission, we will make sure to do that. And please, while we're going through this webinar, if you have other questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or drop them in the Q&A, and we'd be happy to address them. And we'll also take questions at the end as well. So as Julia said, we saw some really cool alignment with InnerOrbit and state tests. And one of the biggest takeaways that we saw is the more and more you can give students exposure to three-dimensional summative assessments, the more they are going to feel prepared in order to tackle a state test in a similar format. So what we want to talk about right now is how you could start beginning to build summative assessments, and we'll talk about how you could build them with InnerOrbit specifically in order to potentially create an assessment that could see similar results down the line. So first of all, a summative assessment, just to clarify, is designed to measure that final proficiency either on a single NGSS standard, or it could be a larger end of unit or even a mastery benchmark that is on multiple standards. These summative assessments you ideally want to give after you've gathered some initial diagnostic data, so you understand where students are at currently, and then you want to give some specific instruction on those standards and then assess them afterwards. So when we are looking at building these summative assessments, one of the things that we want to make sure that we're doing with the design in order to make sure that we're measuring mastery is keeping the assessment to primarily two-dimensional and three-dimensional questions. So two-dimensional and three-dimensional questions are when you're looking at the different dimensions of the NGSS, the DCI, the CCC, and the SEP. A two-dimensional question would be taking the DCI and then also layering in the CCC or the SEP. And then a three-dimensional question would be using all three dimensions of the standard. And the reason we want to do this is because this is seeing if students can actually take their knowledge and apply it to a new situation and actually use the skills we've taught them, look at the information through a specific lens, and if they can bring all of that together. So when writing these assessments, we want to focus our energy on 2D and 3D questions to make sure that we are actually seeing students demonstrate mastery on all aspects of the standard. So we want to show you some examples of some 2D and 3D questions that you could give using some InnerOrbit examples here. So this is a phenomena cluster that is found on InnerOrbit. It is for MSLS 3.1, and it is titled, "Why Should We Be Extra Careful Around X-rays?" So this phenomena talks about how X-rays emit radiation, and how large levels of radiation can eventually mutate cells and DNA. So this talks about the DNA structure and how this can affect chromosomes, and brings it back to a student's real life experience as far as potentially wearing a lead apron or wearing a lead vest, and why different practices would do that. So when looking at this phenomena, an example of a two-dimensional question that we could ask, looking at the CCC specifically, would be something like this. How do changes to the structure of DNA mutations alter our traits? So for MSLS31, the DCI, the content that students are learning about, is traits. So being able to look at chromosomes and the inheritance of those traits. And the CCC, the cross-cutting concept they need to apply, is structure and function. So this question specifically asks about how do changes to the structure of DNA, how that would affect traits. So we're not just asking students to recall information about DNA and chromosomes, we're adding in that additional layer to it. And this helps us start to see if students can implement the cross-cutting concept within assessments. And in a little bit, I'll show you some examples of data that can be collected through InnerOrbit, where you can actually start measuring how students are doing on these different specific dimensions. An example of a two-dimensional question, which is now going to be taking the content and now incorporating the SCP, looking at that same phenomena, is which statement best explains the phenomena happening in figure 2? So the DCI is still the same. We're still asking students to look at traits and the variation of traits. But now we're asking them to implement the SCP, which is developing and using models. So in this case, figure 2 is those pictures down there. And so students need to be able to look at this model and to be able to interpret information from the model. So again, we're able to start measuring some student mastery to see if they can actually use that SCP within an assessment item. And again, the data that you can get from here is you can isolate what parts of the dimension students are struggling with, so you can then offer them targeted support in order to help them improve moving forward. And the last type of question that we want to offer our students is a three-dimensional question. And this is where that true mastery is measured, because this incorporates all dimensions of the standard within one question. So this question asks, your classmates are putting together models to show how mutations affect organisms on a molecular level. Which student's model best illustrates this? So we're asking students to look at different models, and we're asking them to look at the structure and function of the DNA and the different aspects within those models, while still obviously looking at the overall content of traits and DNA and chromosomes. So this is ultimately where we want to get students to go. And so it's crucial to incorporate these questions on summative assessments in order to make sure that students are actually able to master this. So now that we've talked about a little bit of the DNA of a summative assessment with those 2D and 3D questions, now let's talk about some strategies that you could actually use in order to implement summative assessments. And one thing that we really want to highlight here, whether you are a current InnerOrbit partner or if you're somebody who is interested potentially in InnerOrbit, is InnerOrbit has taken the time to create some of these summative premates. So these are small clusters of questions that are 2D and 3D questions and can be used as a summative assessment for all of the different NGSS standards. So for example, MSLS 1.4, we have this pre-made assessment that is 4 questions long, and it is a summative because it includes one 2D question on the DCI and the CCC, one two-dimensional question on the DCI and the SCP, and then 2 3D questions that incorporate all of the dimensions. And so this is a short summative that you can get that can help you see if students have demonstrated mastery. And if they haven't, you could then look and see, is it more of a CCC problem or more of an SCP problem once you go ahead and look at the data. So when it comes to actually building these summative assessments with these InnerOrbit premates, it can actually be a much easier, simpler process. For example, let's say you are teaching an open SciEd unit, and within the unit, you are covering 4 main standards: MSPS 1.3, LS 1.2, LS 1.6, LS 2.3. Let's say after you do your instruction that's focusing on MSPS 1.3, so like the part of the unit that really hones in on that one performance expectation, that one standard. You could then go onto InnerOrbit, look up MSPS 13, and you could assign the sense-making summative to students. It's short, 4 questions, but the data that you can get from that is being able to actually see if your students are starting to demonstrate mastery with this one standard. And this could be a really informative point within the unit to decide if you need to go back and reteach certain aspects of the standard to students, or if students are feeling comfortable enough with this one standard to move on to a new one. The other strategy that you could use or use in tandem with the lesson summative is assigning unit summatives. So once you are completely done with 7.4 matter cycling and photosynthesis, and you're ready to give a unit assessment, you could, on InnerOrbit, build an assessment using all of our premates. So you could incorporate the 4 questions from MSPS 1.3, the 4 questions from MS-LS 1.2, the 4 from LS 1.6, and the 4 from LS 2.3, and put all 4 of those questions into one large assessment to give at the end of the unit. And now you've got a 12-question summative, all 2D and 3D questions, and you can look at those results and see if your students are demonstrating mastery on those individual standards or not, and therefore getting an idea of if they gathered what they needed to from the unit. The last strategy that could be used, before I talk about that, one thing I wanted to take the time to highlight is we have also taken the time in InnerOrbit to group these summative premates and our formatives as well into these easy to follow guides. So for example, I have got the Open SciEd 7th grade units, and all of the specific standards for those units are listed, and there's direct links on our website to those premade summative assessments. So as a teacher, if I'm ready to give a summative, I could go to this document, click that link, and then I'm brought directly to the summative premade that I could then immediately assign to my students. And while I used Open SciEd as the example, we also have alignment guides for multiple different NGSS aligned curriculum. We have alignment for Amplify at the elementary and middle school levels. We have lab aids at the middle school level, mystery science for elementary, and new visions for high school bio, earth and space science. So these are different alignment guides that we have available that have these links that can connect to InnerOrbit. And the last summative strategy I wanted to talk about was a mastery benchmark. So these mastery benchmarks are what a majority of our partners did within our research. And what's interesting about a mastery benchmark is our partners picked around 10 priority performance expectations. So these are standards that they picked that they want to identify as high priority. And they did this by getting a nice zoomed out view of the data and wanted to either focus on specific SEPs or CCCs or foundational concepts, whatever they felt like needed to be addressed. They can go ahead and present that to their teachers and then focus on that within their instruction. And this is nice because these mastery benchmarks can also be great practice for the state test because it incorporates multiple performance expectations that are all at that 2D, 3D level, which is what a majority of our state tests are at. One thing that's important to note with mastery benchmarks, if you're choosing to go this route, is that priority performance expectations need to stay the same throughout all the assessments, regardless of your scope and sequence or your pacing. So we're not necessarily designing mastery benchmarks for current units. We are assigning mastery benchmarks for the entire year, and we're assessing on those standards throughout the entire year, regardless of where we're currently at within our instruction. So one potential path you could take with mastery benchmarks is you could first give a diagnostic benchmark. And what's important about this is just figuring out what prior knowledge students have around those performance expectations before you implement any instruction. So if you are doing 7th grade, before you teach those 7th grade middle school standards you know you're going to cover, get some additional information first on where they're at with those SEPs, those CCCs, and those DCIs before you do your instruction. And then from there, partway through the year, you could administer this mastery benchmark. And this is, again, a way for you to measure, have they reached mastery with these performance expectations? And what's awesome about InnerOrbit and our data, which I'm going to show you here more in a little bit, what's awesome about this is once you get that data, you now have information to actually inform instruction to make change. So if there's a specific standard students are doing well with, if there's a specific SEP students aren't doing well with, you can come together as a group and decide how you're going to address those targeted areas. And we're going to be talking a lot more about how to do that specifically in our next webinar. That's why we got a series here. And then what you can do after you've implemented some actionable change is you can give that exact same mastery benchmark later on in the year. And what's great about this is if you've given that same assessment twice on those priority standards that don't necessarily align with scope and sequence, you can actually see if your change in instruction actually moved the needle or not. So if you identified specific targeted areas from that first mastery benchmark, you can actually see if your instructional practices were able to support students or not when they took it again later. And a cool resource that we're really excited to share with all of you is we have actually created a sample integrated summative assessment that you can use as a reference for what a benchmark may look like. So the idea behind this is that it's to mimic what a state test may look like as far as having primarily 2D and 3D questions, and also being a mixture of different content areas. So this middle school summative, sample summative has life science, physical science, and earth and space within it. And the first page on this document is going to kind of give you a step-by-step guide on how you could eventually build your own mastery benchmark. So a few things that I want to kind of circle back from now that we've talked about different ways to implement a summative, and we've talked about the DNA of a summative, if you will, just some best practices to keep in mind. One of the things that we found really fascinating with our research is that shorter assessments can be just as effective as longer ones. As you all know, overtesting can be really common, especially in those targeted grade levels. So we don't want to give our students assessment fatigue. And so assigning 30, 40, 50 long assessments can really bog them down. And we found that those 10, 12 question assessments can get similar results. So if we don't need to have students testing for as long and get the same results, going with the shorter option is nice for both students and teachers. This way, you also don't need to devote large chunks of class time to give these assessments. That's always a struggle too, as far as like, when are we going to do this? So if you're making them shorter, you have more instructional time, which is so incredibly valued. And then from there, you have this ability then also to look at those priority standards and make sure that's what you're primarily focusing on with those mastery benchmarks to again ensure that over-assessing isn't necessarily an issue. Another best practice that we're going to dive a lot more into in the next webinar, I've only mentioned that a couple times, is really how you can leverage InnerOrbit's dimensional data in order to actually target those opportunity areas to actually help improve student performance. And so by giving those 2D and 3D questions, you're able to then see how are my students doing specifically on questions only focused on a CCC versus an SEP. And when you have that data, you can then figure out how you want to then best support students within your classroom. And that's what our third webinar is going to be about, is some actual implementation strategies, some actual tools that we've developed here in InnerOrbit that you can give and use to actually help move that needle. That's what our third webinar is going to be all about. The other thing that can be leveraged within InnerOrbit is looking at trends district-wide. And this is where being able to zoom out at this level can be so powerful. So when you're looking at the SEPs and the CCCs and even the DCIs, you could zoom out and look at all of your schools, all of your grade levels, and again, see if you can notice any patterns or trends. Maybe the entire district needs help with developing and using models. If that's the case, you can do a district-wide PD to support everybody. Maybe there is a school site that is a standout that's just like killing it with analyzing, interpreting data. And you can call them up and be like, what are y'all doing? Your students are doing awesome. And they're like, oh my gosh, that's right. I went to this conference and I found this activity and it's amazing. I haven't had time to tell people because time is hard to find around here. And so this way you can kind of share and disseminate that information easier once you kind of see where those standouts might potentially be. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Julia in order to wrap up everything that we discussed today and also to give you all some clear next steps of what you can do after this webinar if you would like to.
Well, thank you, Emily. Before we wrap up, I actually want to address one of the questions that we got in the Q&A. So where can we find this alignment guides? I am dropping a link right now that will guide you through our different alignment guides for different curricula. But this is always available if you're navigating on InnerOrbit. This is always available on the site. There's this little button at the top in the navigation that says curricula connections, or assess curricula actually. And that actually guides you through this page. And you can find all those PDFs and all those connections there. All right. But actually now on to our wrap up. We've covered so much. So let's do a quick summary. Not a summative, summary. So first and foremost, our research showed 97% average alignment between InnerOrbit summatives and NGSS state proficiency levels. That kind of consistency is really huge for both teachers and students, so we would want to get our students there. In terms of structures, we found that assessments built with 2- and 3-dimensional questions targeting SCPs, DCIs, and cross-cutting concepts are not only aligned, but give us the dimensional data that we need to drive instruction forward. We also highlighted different summative strategies that schools are using successfully in districts, including our pre-made summative assessments, our unit-based summatives, and custom-built mastery benchmarks too. And finally, one of the biggest takeaways is that shorter focus assessments are just as effective than longer ones. And they help reduce test fatigue, increase instructional time, and give teachers the ability to collect data more frequently throughout the year. So if you're feeling like Irving here and you're like, oh, what a month. I know it's been, what a webinar. This has been a lot, but seriously, we're excited about what this research means when districts give students repeated opportunities to transfer that knowledge into novel 3-dimensional scenarios. We're not just prepping for a test, which is kind of like the main thing here. We're genuinely growing science thinkers and helping our students through the process of making sense of novel phenomena. Thank you so much for joining us. We'd love to support you and your team. And if you like this kind of content, follow us on social. We have a Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, but actually the most active that we are is on YouTube. So if you want to see all of our webinars, please subscribe to our YouTube channel at InnerOrbit NGSS. And you can always email us if you have suggestions or feedback at inquiries@innerorbit.com. And we will email a recording of the webinar and a link to download the sample summative assessments that we shared in this session. Thank you so much for being here. And we really appreciate you taking some time in your afternoon to join us today.